Okay, thank you all for coming. This is our last presentation of the day, and this is one that's close to my heart because I grew up just about a block from what we're going to talk about. And it's the site of old Fort Pierce, the original fort. But more important, more important in history probably, is that it's the site of the Ice Indian culture, in which we don't know exactly how many years that goes back. We do know that modern humans are 200,000 years old, and that with the information that they're finding at the Vero Beach, the old Ice Age man dig up there, is that humans could have lived in this area of Florida as long as 16,000 years ago. And so, and that was perhaps, if you go with their theory, simultaneous with mastodons, mammoths, saber-toothed sloths, and all kinds of things. But Lucille's going to talk about that in just a second. First, just a couple of things. I want to make sure that all of you know that you get a free subscription today to Indian River Magazine, and you can sign up for one at the Indian River Magazine tent at the end. And also that a lot of the information that you'll hear today on the Seminole War history is in a magazine that is available as you leave. It's the one with the Seminole on the cover. So make sure you pick a copy of that up as you leave. That's free, and just pick it up. It's the story. It contains the story that Rick wrote. Then the last thing is, last year with these festivals, we always try to do something that makes a lasting impact. Last year, we bought a grave memorial for Lucia Zora, the circus woman who laid in an unmarked grave for 80 years. In life, she was the bravest woman in the world. She was an animal trainer. But in death, she was unheralded for 80 years until we put a marker on her grave last year. So this year, what we want to do is, Edwin Binney, who was one of the people that we talked about last year, he helped lead the effort to dig the Fort Pierce Inlet, and he also created the port of Fort Pierce. And he also, in 1929, saved the bank across the street from closing by making major deposits into it. So there's really no memorial with public access and nothing on the inlet. We want to get something that at least faces the inlet, or that people can have access to know about the things that he did. He was an industrialist. He invented the Crayola crayon. And if any of you know the Chapmans and the Bennies around here, but that's all part of that family. So I'm going to pass this petition around, and if you want to sign it, all it says is to consider making a memorial. So thank you very much. So on our panel today, we have Lucille Wright, who is she was a longtime teacher in St. Lucie County, and I'll have her tell you how she became interested in the old fort site. And but she's also, I would say, an amateur archaeologist.
Yeah.
Okay, amateur, yes. But so she'll go first, and then next we have Rick Creary, who's he's a lawyer, but somehow I got to take advantage of his writing skills for Indian River Magazine. And he's also interested in history, and he's just done some wonderful stories for us. And he is going to talk about the Seminole War period, and his story is in that issue that I just told you about. And next we have Harry Quintero, who has worked, he's the registrar for the St. Lucie County History Center. And he's the caretaker of, he's going to mention some of the artifacts that we have and that have been discovered at the site and so forth. But more importantly, I would really give Harry a lot of credit, and Lucille, with saving a lot of the Harry Hill photos and taking care of them over the years. Pretty much any old photo that you see from the early 1900s is a Harry Hill photo, and he really chronicled the history of the whole Treasure Coast with his photos, and his little studio is right down the street and still standing. And next to him is Matthew Samuel, the head of the Lions Club of Fort Pierce, who for a long time, the old fort site, it had no signage or anything. You went there and you really didn't know what it was or anything. And they went in and cleaned it up, and they helped get the signs for it, so that now you can go see it and you can see both you learn about both the prehistoric periods and the modern periods. And I'm sorry, the Sunrise Theater doesn't like Apple products, so my Mac doesn't work on the thing, so we had some photos and so forth, but we don't have those today. And also next to me is Colonel Franklin Pierce, after whom Fort Pierce is named.
My name is Jim Odell.
And next to him is General Jessup.
My name is Dick Casmar.
So Lucille, we'll start with you. Tell us how you came about, your interest grew from the old fort site. And the old fort site is on South Indian River Drive. It's about exactly 1 mile from here. And you'll see it right on the right. It says Old Fort Park, I think. And you can go there, and it's a very small park, and you spend 10 minutes there, and half an hour? Okay. An hour? Okay. So, but it's got a mound, and I'll have Lucille talk about that too, and that's a very visible sign. So just tell us how you got interested.
Well, I taught school for 25 years in Fort Pierce Elementary School and loved it. And I ended up extra being an enrichment teacher, so that the students who were especially interested in things, we would go, and also the teachers. I taught them local history also. And we would go down to this fort site. There were no archaeologists here. All we knew was what the Historical Society knew about the fort site. And we'd pick up black stuff, which turned out to be pottery shards, and still didn't think anything about it. Finally, archaeologists came, and Andrew Asbury was one who came, and his father had been an archaeologist. And so the Archaeological Society started in Stewart. So we all came up to the fort, came up to Fort Pierce Park. And as soon as Andy got there, he said, well, look over there south. That's where the Indians lived. We said, what do you mean? The Indians lived on the backyard of the Minton property? Yes, the whole Minton property had been part of the Midden meaning where they lived, worked, ate, and everything. And black soil was there, and oyster shells were there. And my God, it opened up a whole new world. It was more than just history, it was pre-history. So what did we call those pre-history Indians? Nobody knows. They didn't write, they didn't read, they didn't have pencils or paper or anything like that. But the Spanish came in 1565, and the King of Spain had given to Pedro Menendez the area of La Florida. And of course he was supposed to make a lot of money off of it. So he came, and of course he found that there were French already up near Jacksonville. And in Europe, the Huguenots and the Catholics were terrible enemies of each other. And that carried over to Florida, because Menendez, during a storm, took his troop up to that Jacksonville fort and killed everybody he could. And a few got away. But that actually ended the settlement of Florida by the French. Menendez then came back, and some Indians told him there was some more further south, so he went further south to next inlet, which with the soldiers, and there still were some Huguenots, and they couldn't get across the inlet there. So nobody knows what Pedro Menendez said to Ribault, who was the French leader, but he was well-known navigator and everything, because the next day they had given their weapons to the Spanish, and as the Spanish took them across the inlet, they then took them behind the dunes and slit their throats. And they killed all they could. And that ended, believe me, anybody who wanted to come up here. Today, that's the Matanzas Inlet, just south of St. Augustine, and it means, what do you think it means? Massacre? From that. Then Menendez came on down.
Let's get to the old fort.
Yes, he came on down walking, and the Indians ran from him. So then he came to one inlet, which we hope was our old inlet, and the Indians didn't run, and the chief's name was AYS. What were the Indians called? Nobody knows, because the Spanish then called the Indians AYS, A's, I's, or I's, however you want to say it. And he continued on. Anyway, let me tell you about the ones that mostly people call the A's today. They were hunters, gatherers. They did not grow anything because the Indian River was out there filled with fish, oysters, crabs, you name it. They had a rich bounty of food. There were animals on this land which nobody occupied except the Indians, so that they had good meat and things. They didn't have famines here like the northern Indians did, who were under the control of the Spanish. The Spanish came down to the A's, made treaties, went back to St. Augustine, and the A's continued to live their lifestyle. Among that was when the whales were migrating along the coast, the pilot whales and the right whales, the A's would get in their dugout, wooden canoes, usually cypress or pine, go out among the whales, have 3 wooden plugs in their loincloth, and when the whales came up to breathe, they would jump on the back of the whale and pound that wooden plug in the blowhole. And guess what? It killed them. So they would tow that back in and eat as much as they could. They also fired, grilled things to make jerky like.
What do we know about the, for lack of a better description, I'm just going to call it the old fort site. I know that's not worthy of what it meant to the prehistory Indians or culture that was there. But why were they attracted to that site, and what evidence do we have that well, you said the Middens, that they lived there and so forth, but there's something unique about that site.
Yes, there is. It used to have a spring of water. The Savannah, the water table was higher than it is now. And the force of the water from the savannas forced its way through a weak place. And this spring came out of the bank into the river. So there was fresh water, which wasn't always attainable. That was for the Indians as well as the fort later on. The Indians also had a practice of building their chief's, what shall I say, burial site behind the village. That we knew that because it still happened in recent history. So when we had 2 hurricanes in 1 month down here, it eroded the bank out. And guess what? We had an elderly archaeologist visiting from Long Island, and as he was walking around looking at that, he saw this black circle in the sand. And he said, that looks like a post hole. And he got a graduate student who was there that came over and said, yes, that is a post hole. Post hole meaning that's where the sapling tree was put down to make the hut for the Indians to live in. And when it decayed, it left a black circle. So that finally showed us that the Indians had been living where the road is, next to the river. So they went down and made a map that showed 1,500 years of the mound. And it showed all these little huts along the river for the first time due to the hurricanes. What happened to those Indians? Well, there again, archaeology came in, and they were looking south, and they saw this crushed oyster shells around the fence of the Minton property. Mrs. Minton was then owner of the property. And he said, huh, that's a midden. Archaeology, just like that. He could recognize what it was. So if you saw our table, you could see the pictures that we brought today of the first dig that was done on that Minton property, which was showing that it was black dirt, meaning it's a midden, that it had lots of shells in it, it had lots of pottery, lots of broken pottery in it, and that's where the Indians went.
And when she refers to the Minton property, she's talking about an area 3/4 of a mile, maybe, from the old fort site?
No, right next to it.
Oh, right, okay, that was owned by the Mintons,
Uh-huh.
okay.
Yeah, it was a fence dividing their property from the fort site. What else can I tell you about the Mittens, the Indians? They never grew anything. They never had famine. They were excellent spear throwers. When Jonathan Dickinson was shipwrecked, he walked along the shore with his crew and slaves and so forth, and he went from tribe to tribe. When he got with the Indians that were around Jupiter Inlet, there were more Indian mounds there than there are now. So he went ahead and talked with them and then wrote a book when he got to Philadelphia. That's our one resource. Another resource is the letters that Menendez wrote to the king explaining why he killed all those Huguenots and also what he was doing. And he said that when they first went to those friendly Indians, the chief's name was AYS. So it's your choice. You either say A's, I's, or I's, because we'll never know how to say it, because there are none left.
And tell us about the mound, that there's actually, it's pretty sacred ground.
Yes, it is sacred ground. We've had professional archaeologists come there, and they have determined that it is a burial mound, Indian burial mound. And they stopped digging, because it is very illegal to dig in an Indian burial mound. If they catch you, you lose everything you've got in connection with it. Maybe even go to jail. So it was there, and he also said that there were other, maybe 200 burials in there, because as you dig down, I have learned that they put a chief who has power. They want to keep that power in their village, so they keep the chief, and they put oyster shells around him, and the more oyster shells there are, the more powerful he becomes. I learned that in Puerto Rico.
Okay, so Menendez comes in 1565, and by about 1600, all the eyes, however we want to pronounce it, because we can pronounce it any way we want to, because there was no written language, as Lucille teaches us. Thank you. So what do we know about the site between the disappearance of the eyes in the 1600s and the start of its use as a fort in 1838? Was there any archaeology that showed anything on the site between those years?
Well, written history shows us that the Spanish Indians, which are Florida Indians, fought with the English Indians when Georgia and them came over. And eventually the English Indians came down, and the Spanish Catholics had built missions from Tallahassee to St. Augustine. And those English Indians went to each mission, burned it, took prisoners, killed some, and that was the end of those Indians. Now remember, those Indians were friendly to the Spanish.
But did they actually live on the site?
Who?
The Indians that you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay,
Those
on that site?
Not
Okay.
on that site.
Okay,
Wait, what?
right, but what that site specifically?
All right, that site.
What the archaeology on that site shows?
Okay, the archaeology on that site shows that that it's a burial Indian mound, and their mound that's there is about 18 feet tall. It has steps that have been in there for well, before I was teaching school, so say for a couple generations. And it allows you to walk up over the mound to the top, just like the Indians did. And when you do, you don't dig. You simply sit there and you look around at the ocean, the river, and you think of the peoples who live there and who are buried down there. One of the soldiers also, during the Seminole Wars, died the day that they came there, and they buried him, but we don't know where.
Okay. That's a good segue into Rick's. Okay,
Yeah.
one last.
One thing I want to tell you about this. These Indians were very smart, and you have to give them credit. They had spears with retractable points that they could put in so that when they threw them to animals, the point stayed in the animals, and they still had the spear that they could put another point in to kill them. This is called an atlatl. None of you, I'm sure, have seen this very often. The Indians developed this, and it has a little hook right here at this end and holes for your fingers. Wait a minute. Now, what did they use this for? The Spanish had horses with armor on later on as they came over. So the Indians developed this, which you would put the tip of the spear in this little stone-like that holds it in there. They then would take this back this way, and with their strength, which they threw this anyway, they would throw it, and it would go through a horse with armor on it and kill it. No point on it. So we can say also, Jonathan Dickinson said that those Indians were such good spearers that they could go out in the Indian River and spear fish, hitting only the dorsal fin, so it didn't hurt the meat or anything. And they could get a lot of fish to eat. It must have been great.
Thank you very much, Lucille. Okay, so we've arrived at about the era of 1838, and I'm going to ask Rick to kind of explain, give us a real quick primer on just how the Seminole War started and the use of that site and development of it as a fort. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just say that briefly, a lot of people who move into Florida don't really realize that the Seminole Indians were not the native Indians here. They were refugees from Southeast America. As the United States was expanding, this was still part of Spain's province, and for a little while it was also, for 20 years, a British colony. And the Seminoles were refugees who moved in, Creek Indians mostly. They had two different languages, so some of them had to deal with one another with sign language. But the Spanish and the British let them do what they wanted and weren't really concerned with their presence. But in 1821, the United States was able to acquire Florida from Spain. And almost immediately, the Americans did have a problem with the Seminoles being present. In 1824, they had a treaty called the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, where they gave the Seminoles 20 years to stay in Florida. But by 1830, Andrew Jackson was the president, and his Congress passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, where the decision was that all Indians in the eastern United States who did not assimilate into American culture had to move to the west side of the Mississippi. And that included the Seminoles. So the American government renegotiated the treaty with the Seminoles, and the Seminoles took the position that they were forced to sign the treaty in 1834, by which they agreed to relocate. Osceola, who everyone has heard of, was not really one of the leading chiefs, but he was the leading war spirit as far as not wanting to comply with what the U.S. government wanted. And he famously stuck his dagger through the treaty. He also threatened the leaders of the Seminole tribe with death if they cooperated with America, and actually did, or some of the followers with him did kill one of the major chiefs in the Seminoles. By the time Fort Pierce was founded, Osceola had already been captured. General Jessup, who I'm sure we'll hear from, had taken over the conduct of the war. And the war started in 1835. It was the longest American Indian war in U.S. history, 1835 to 1842, and the costliest. And it's largely forgotten because it was an unpopular war. Among the Indians were runaway slaves, and so it became a very important issue in Congress. There was a growing abolitionist movement, and the Southerners did not want a home-free zone down here for slaves. And the Seminoles accepted the African Americans as part of their tribe. So in 1835, Osceola was living up in Ocala and was pressing for resistance. So the federal government put together a group of troops under Major Dade of, you've heard Dade County. Tampa was called Fort Brooke, and Ocala was called Fort King. And about 112 troops were going up because there had been a disturbance in the Gainesville area, which was called Hogtown at that time. So the Seminoles learned through, allegedly through some of the black help that was at Fort Brooke, when the soldiers were coming up to reinforce Fort King, and they were ambushed on the way. Now, in Florida history, there's so much that is overlooked and forgotten. This is as big as Custer's Last Stand. Everybody was massacred except 1 to possibly 3 guys. 1 survived ultimately to tell the tale. But anyway, that got the attention of Congress. The war started in earnest. General Jessup had to come and get the Indians. And to give you a perspective, there were only 5,000 Seminoles in the entire gigantic state. And that's enough people to maybe fit into the north end zone of Florida Field, if you've ever been to a Gator game. So in this vast state, where no one was really living south of Ocala or a little bit below, except over in the Tampa area, a lot of Americans felt like, why not just let them stay down there? Who's ever going to want to live in swampy Florida? And that's the way General Jessup felt as well. And he thought, draw a line from where Melbourne is today over to Tampa and let them have it.
Because of the time.
Okay.
But let's get to the establishment of Fort Pierce.
Okay. Well, Jessup, how do you track down that few of Indians in that vast territory? He came up with the brilliant idea of establishing forts and depots crisscrossing Florida, which was largely unmapped at that time. And remember, they had to do this by horseback and and marching. And so they started building the forts, and that was forcing the Indians southward. And the Indians, there was one major battle that happened over in Okeechobee in late 1837. And General Jessup then ordered the establishment of the fort that was to become Fort Pierce at that time, and he did it for the purpose of launching a major attack against the Seminoles, as he was forcing them down with all his crisscrossing forts, they actually were congregating down around the Jupiter area. And he launched the Battle of Loxahatchee from there. Now, there's a fantastic book that's unfortunately out of print called Journey to into Wilderness by Jacob Rhett Mott. And he was a young Army surgeon who had gone to Harvard and studied literature. He was so bored for the couple of years that he was traveling around and didn't have anything to read, so he wrote his own book. And this is how we know when Fort Pierce was established. He's quoted in all the major works on the Second Seminole War. So he keeps a very detailed account of when they arrived. On December 31st, 1837, they were at the inlet. And on the 2nd, they came and picked out the highest bluff along the Indian River. And that day, they formed a little blockade or blockhouse, which he said was like any other fort except it was made out of palm logs. And that was on January 2nd, 1838.
And they named it?
Yes, they named it after Benjamin Pierce, their major, Fort Pierce. And 2 weeks later, General Jessup came down with 1,000 men from one side, 1,000 came down the inland, and already about 1,000 men had come in.
I was always confused about the Mott entry. Did Pierce actually come here and command the fort, or
Yes.
was he giving orders from another location?
No, Jessup gave the orders to establish this. Pierce actually came down, and within several days he turned around and went back north to get additional supplies. But Mott clearly states
And
that.
he was actually here.
He was actually here.
To establish it.
And then Jessup actually arrived with the last of his troops, got them all together. Remember, everything to the west of here was swamp. It was like part of the Everglades. It was called the Alpatioke Swamp, but it was really part of the Everglades. And the troops had to march through the swamp to get down to the Jupiter area for the Battle of Loxahatchee.
And if you go to the site, it's a beautiful site of oak trees and sable palm trees. And the fort was actually constructed, the logs for the garrison were constructed with sable palm. If you can just imagine how strong and what a deterrent that would be. And then they used thatch palm for the roofs of the fort, right?
Right.
Describe the fort for us. What did it have? And
Well, it was described here as simply a little blockhouse, which is almost like a log cabin at first. And then they built additional ones, and after that, they, some months later, I suppose, weeks later, built the wall around it. And it was still there in 1843 at the end of the war, and a gentleman named Francis Whedon bought it and used it for his homestead. But it burned down that first year.
yeah, and the fence. What's the wall called? The fence. What's it called?
Yeah, Palisades, right.
Okay, the Palisades went right along the riverbank, and I don't know if at the time there was more of a bank there. Right now it's kind of flat and it flows into the river, and the freshwater stream is still there. There's still water coming that flows into the river where they would have gotten their fresh water, and it was it could be seen up until the mid 1960s. We just talked to Roy Summerlin, whose Uncle Bill Summerlin used to actually live on the site in a house, and he remembered the stream that you could see before. Now culverts cover it and so forth, but it had the Palisades right on the riverbank, so that if they tried to attack by water, they couldn't. But the interesting thing about the fort is there was never anything that happened. There was never any battle there. They never were attacked at the fort. But who were some of the famous people that came into the fort, and who and yeah, who were some of the famous people,
Well-
better known?
They actually weren't expecting, they had so many guys there, they weren't expecting to get attacked so much because by this time and after the Battle of Loxahatchee, the Seminoles were reduced to small bands, one of whom was Coacoochee or Wildcat. And future General Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, was a 21-year-old lieutenant there at the end of the war, and he rode out and captured Wildcat and brought him into the fort.
Interesting. So, and then the fort, like you said, the fort burned to the ground. And just to speed up the archaeology, one of the archaeologists, I think it was Robert Carr, who determined that the actual, it says Old Fort Park, but the Old Fort probably wasn't at that site. It was probably in the block, in the next lot. It's privately owned to the north. That they could, John Durham, an amateur archaeologist, very well known, and I'll let Harry talk about that, but Dr. Danahauer, who lives in the house immediately north of the fort, or maybe there's another house there now, but for a long time did, remember John Durham, he thought it was Durham, uncovered some sort of a timber which might have indicated that it was more, that the fort was located more towards there, which also would have made sense that for the location, because of the bluff, it's a higher point. And also that if you read some of the literature, that the Indian Mound would have actually been a lookout, because it's just offers a beautiful panoramic of the whole Indian River Lagoon, and so forth. I'll move to Harry next, and since we brought up John Durham, tell us about, thank you, Rick.
The artifacts that we have here today are from the John Durham collection that is housed at the St. Lucie County Regional History Center. They were acquired by the county in 2006 from the family. The artifacts in that case are all from Fort Pierce, were found at that site. The objects in that case are perhaps from Fort Pierce, but they're listed as unknown origin. There are some ice artifacts in that case, the necklace and some little trinkets, shark's teeth, and the like.
Yeah, and just the site's protected, so you can't dig or anything on the site.
Any longer, yeah. John got in under the wire. He was there before any, I guess, how he was able to.
Anything else here?
No.
Okay. Next, Matt, tell us all about the Lions Club and their improvements to the site, and how you took that as a project to undertake.
Okay. 4 years ago, our board got together and we wanted to do something for the city. Usually people come to the city and ask what city can do for them, but we gave them a $30,000 grant, and we worked with Public Works, Paul Bertram, Mike Reels. We would furnish the material and they'd furnish the labor. We came in there and we put a fence along Indian River Drive. We put curbing in the park. We paved it in there. We put some kiosks in there, which we could not have done without Lucille Wright.
When you say kiosks, those are the signs?
Those are the information signs. There's 3 of them in there. One of them is with the fort, one is with the mound, and the third one is all the tools that the Indians used over the years. And we put like 300 truckloads of dirt on the mound because it was washing away from the hurricanes that we have, and we planted plants on it which are stabilizing the mound. And it's really a beautiful site. If you've never been there, it's at 900 South Indian River Drive. You can take the steps up to the top of it and look around, and it's a beautiful view of the Indian River Lagoon. It's a little treasure that Fort Pierce has now.
I always think of it kind of as our cradle of civilization, and our first issue of, we also publish Fort Pierce magazine every year, and we did our first issue 10 years ago. That was a story that we did, and I wrote the headline, and I called it Sacred Shore. But and it really is kind of a sacred shore to me.
Yes, it is.
Next we have Colonel Benjamin Kendrick Pierce, and that's Jim Odell. Jim, first of all, I want to know, is that real wool?
Yes, sir. It smells like sheep actually right now.
Okay. Thanks, I'm glad you're over on that side. But tell us how you came to play Colonel Pierce as a reenactor, and what were some of his qualities that would be admirable? Or what were some of his qualities that would not be admirable?
Well, it's a sweet and sour story of Colonel Pierce, but I was born and raised here in Fort Pierce out in Everett Road on a hog farm, and I always thought the old Fort School was just, the city was named after somebody from Fort Pierce, a war hero, Spanish-American War or something and stuff. And it's not taught in school. There's nothing about it in school at all, about our town, which is one of the most historic cities on the east coast of Florida. Big story, but this was, I've done research and I've done reading on it. I'm a living historian, which means I try to acquire as much information as I can. And Our Worthy Commander is a thin little book like this. It's a whole lot to it, but the internet has opened up windows and windows and windows for me. So I found out a lot about Mr. Pierce, and it's a bittersweet tragedy. I mean, he was married 3 times. He had several kids. Only one lived to adulthood. His first kid at Fort Mackinac up in Michigan was only 10 years old when 10 months old when it died. This is his first real post. He's the executive officer in charge of, and he became the commander of it. And when Major General Jessup here heard of this fine man as a up-and-coming officer, Reverend Lieutenant Colonel and stuff, he said it chose him to come down the coastline from the Haulover to establish all the supply forts. And Colonel Pierce sat there and said, no problem, we'll take care of it. And came down with 11 Powell and his men and found a suitable place to set up the fort. But the guy did 37 years of military service. He had 3 wives, all 3 wives died. All but one child, Josephine, she lived to adulthood. And she's buried in Governor's Island with him.
We also did, I failed to mention that he was from New Hampshire, and he's the brother of President Franklin Pierce.
Oh, not only that, his father was Governor Pierce, twice elected. He was a hero of Bunker Hill, served under George Washington. Franklin Pierce was also a senator. He was also in the Army and stuff. He bowed out, became a senator and stuff, and worked his way up to President of the United States. So when you have your president as your commander-in-chief as a brother, there's a couple of letters they have in the Historical Society over there where he talks about stuff. But it's just a military family, like from my background, and I've come to, even though he's from Hillsborough, New Hampshire, and I'm a cracker from Florida, I have a great appreciation for him, being former military myself.
Excellent. Thanks for all you do to bring this back to life, Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Enza. Thank you and everybody on this panel for helping keep our city growing. So this history is what made it.
Okay, next, General Jessup, if you don't mind standing, because you're resplendent in that uniform. And I'm told that it's actually, if you'll actually tell us all about it, because I'm told that it's very close to the real thing at the time.
Yes, there is an outfit that will make a uniform to the date and the service that you would like. And so I am told that this is the uniform that would have been worn by Jessup in the day, including the hat.
How long have you been playing General Jessup?
It's been just over a year now.
What were some of the qualities? I think this might even be a question for Rick. Jessup didn't really want to go to war with the Seminoles, did he?
I don't know that that would be true or not. You have any idea on that?
Well, he wasn't very happy about the assignment coming to Florida. In fact, it was in front page news. I can't believe that they published the letters of generals complaining about the duty that they got. But he said basically anybody'd have to be crazy to take this for any other reason than duty, because it's likely to destroy your career to come down here to try to chase these Indians across Florida. And that was a premonition that came true for him. It did ruin his career.
Okay. As Jim mentioned, is there any questions from the audience? Anything about the site, or if you're in the middle, if you'll just come to the side to ask a question, and I'll go around real quickly here.
First, I want to say how great this is. This is really wonderful. For Ms. Wright, would you say, from what you described about how the native Ayes did not farm, would you say that pretty much that what they lived on was what's called now a paleo diet, which is like proteins and just whatever they could forage?
Well, excuse me. I can say that the river used to be so full of fish you could almost walk on the back of the mullet during the spring run. There were oysters, there were clams, there were crabs, fish of all kinds. In fact, when the fort was there, the soldiers all gained weight because they were eating so well, the uniforms got tight on them. So, I don't know if that's a paleo Indian, but it's the original food. Can I add something else? When the Loxahatchee battle was going on, the first time the Indians won and killed the doctor who was with them. So they came to Fort Pierce. All the survivors came up where their doctor took care of them. And if you'd like to know an Indian word, could I teach you how to say Kawakachi? Kawakachi. One more time. Kawakachi. Very good. That's the Indian word for wildcat, who kept the war going after Osceola died. Wildcat was it.
And one other question for General Jessup. Is Jessup, Georgia named for you or your family?
Yes, prior to Florida, I was assigned as second in command to General Winfield Scott, fighting the Creek War in Georgia and in Alabama. So I'm pretty sure it would have been.
Interesting. Going back to Lucille again, when we talked to the Summerlins about the site where Bill Summerlin used to live, that he lived on the old fort site. Roy Summerlin said that there was really good fishing there because of the fresh water coming into the river, and that's a great, snook love that kind of water. And also, a lot of you might not have the notion of how plentiful we don't eat the oysters from the Indian River Lagoon today, but that would have just been like the subsistence food for everybody. You know, you want to walk out and get some oysters.
I have a question for all of you people up there. I've been here 76 years, moved down as a kid, north of River Drive, just north of the Summerlins. And we were told at that time there was an inlet right directly across from us. That closed up, and they opened up the present one in Fort Pierce. Is that true or not?
Yes.
Yes, I'll have Lucille or Rick answered that, but it was the Indian River Inlet. And today we think of the big constructed inlet that we have, which has a seawall, but the inlets back then would open and close. And there's even a little site on South Hutchinson Island where you could see where the storm was coming after some of these storms, where you could almost see it opening up. The county has to go back there and rebuild it. But we see, I'll let Rick add anything you want to on that.
The Indian River Inlet, as St. Lucie Village was once called at one time, that was the Indian River Inlet. That it's exactly opposite St. Lucie Village. If you've never been there, everybody stopped talking about the war. And when it was over with because an Armed Occupation Act was started in 42, where a head of household could get free, 160 acres of land free, if you lived on it, built a house, cultivated things, and carried arms. And that allowed the army to leave, so that the Indians, you could keep the Indians off of your land. That's when St. Lucie Village was started in 1843.
The one thing I'll say about the inlet is many years later, General Sherman, after the Civil War, wrote his memoirs and recalled when he was a young man here in Fort Pierce, stationed here, how dangerous that inlet was. And he knew of a number of people who were drowned, soldiers coming in, and even the pilot who was in charge of leading people in that inlet drowned. So Sherman said he always, when he would come in by boat, he would beach his boat either to the north or the south so he wouldn't risk going over the sandbar and getting drowned.
And one other thing, Colonel Pierce didn't choose the site. The government had an entire group of soldiers with a leader who went around and decided where the forts should be built, so that they did what they told them, so that site had already been chosen for the site for Fort Pierce until the soldiers came down. And then they met at the inlet, as you said. But this one group with Powell, I think his commander was, yeah. So they went around and chose different sites.
Yeah, of course, Powell had recommended it, and Jessup made the decision as to where it went.
Yes, I'm Guy Bachman. I'm with the Loxahatchee Battlefield Preservationists. I'm related to Benjamin Pierce and to Franklin Pierce. And I just wanted to tell you folks that the maiden name of Barbara Bush was Pierce. And I'm also a relative of her. Apparently a third of the country is related to the Bush family. That's absolutely true. They came over on the Mayflower very early. I have a letter that was written by Benjamin Pierce on the 24th of January, 1838, which happened to be the same day as the Battle of the Loxahatchee, and he's writing his brother Franklin, saying that he was aware of Powell's battle. He was stuck up in the storm in St. Augustine. He did complain about the inefficiency and the lack of fighting ability of the naval soldiers in Powell's battle, and complained about our General Jessup in general, and was saying to his brother, who was a senator at the time, gee, is there anything you can do? I hear that the general's going to step down shortly. I would like the command of the theater of war in Florida. So he's trying to take advantage of his connections with Franklin to get a promotion, which apparently never happened. He stayed a colonel, he never became a general. But that's my little story on the Pierce family.
Right.
Very interesting.
Thank you very much. Okay.
I have a question.
Okay, two more questions.
It's not regarding, but there's an Indian River in Delaware also. Is there any connection to the Indian River here?
No.
Okay.
Because why they call the Indian River is after the word AIS, the chief that Lucille referred to. ice. He was the Indian, so they called it the Ice River or the Indian River.
It's the Nanticoke of Delaware. It's Nanticoke.
Okay, it's the Nanticoke. Yes, sir.
Yeah, can I share something? Just to add to what the gentleman was saying here, it was so interesting and I want to say this.
Okay.
Let's look at me as Christopher Columbus. I first landed in Fort Pierce in 1971 in that same inlet. I came to this country as a stowaway. And when I got married in 1973 on the marriage license, instead my last name is Pierre. Instead of putting Pierre, they put Pierce.
Okay, one last question.
Taylor downtown Fort Pierce.
When we got one last question.
Well, mine isn't really a question, it's a plug for the History Museum.
Okay.
Because some people here have never been to.
Okay, it's a wonderful museum. It's right underneath, if you go over the bridge, the South Bridge, and you turn your immediate left, your first left, and then you go back towards the lagoon. That's where the museum is, and it's a wonderful facility. I want to thank you all for coming. Please sign the petition. Don't forget to get your free 1-year subscription to Indian River Magazine. And thank you to our wonderful panel.